Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. Today we're doing another recommended deck tech from Shuddy, so huge shout out to you for recommending Rafiq of the Mini, especially since he's got that nice glow up with the from the list. So Rafiq is a Bant human knight 3/3 with Exalted, which is whenever a creature you control attacks alone, that creature gets +1/+1 till end of turn, and whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gains double strike until the end of turn. As usual, the deck lists are in the description below, and if you want to support my channel, check out my Fiverr. That's going to be in the description below as well. And let's get started. For the Skirmish version, which is our lowest power level, I decided to go with Aura Enchantment Tribal, and just because I'm using Enchantment or Aura Tribal in the low tier doesn't mean that that's the only way it can be built. If you do, I mean, you could definitely build an Enchantment based or Rafiq build that could be battle tier. I'm just using it as the lower tier because you get to do some fun stuff. So starting off with the creatures, classic is Aura Gnarlid. This is holds a special place in my heart. I used to play 60 card auras, and this card was a lot of fun. Is a good beat stick. It gets +1/+1 for each aura that's on the battlefield, and creatures with power less than it can't block it. So a pretty fun invasive creature. He allows Pilgrim, so we can tutor up some of our auras. We've got SRAM, a Core Spirit Dancer, Satyr, Enchanter, so we can draw when we cast our enchantment spells. Siona, Captain of Pyleus, makes humans when auras become attached to a creature you control. And when she enters, you can look at the top 7 and find an aura from among them and put them in trance. A nice little way to gain card advantage. We've got Gaia, Kindler of Hope. I hope I'm saying that name right. So basically, let's just cast our aura and equipment from the top of our library, and the equipment have, when it enters, you can just immediately attach it to a creature, which isn't too relevant here. We just have it so we can cast more auras from the top of our library and get some card advantage that way. Johnny's Chosen, so we can kind of grow wide and at least have some kind of blockers while we're swinging in with Rafiq most likely. Armored Sky Hunter, another way for us to gain card advantage by finding those auras in our deck when we attack. The Sovereigns of Lost Solara, another fun one that's got Exalted, so it'll give that additional +1/+1. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, you may search your library for an aura card that could enchant that creature and put it in the battlefield attached to that creature. So definitely a fun way to cheat in some of our bigger enchantments onto Rafiq and just let them blow out players. Sanctum Weaver, obviously, you get a bunch of mana for having enchantments out. Eidolon of Countless Battles gives the creature that it is enchanting an additional +1/+1 for each creature and +1/+1 for each aura you control. So this guy could be big on his own and can also just make one of our creatures really big. Core Spirit Dancer, again, also gets really big with each aura that's attached to it. An Eternal Witness, so we can get stuff from our graveyards, and a Silent Arbiter to stop people from, getting a bunch of blockers together and putting them on top of our one attacker. For our sorceries, we've got a Winds of Wrath, destroy all creatures that aren't enchanted, so we can potentially get a few enchantments on some of our other creatures too and cast this to kind of blow out the board. Divine Reckoning, each player chooses a creature he or she controls and destroys the rest. It's got flashback, so it's pretty good for us to wipe the board 2 times if we really need to, and we can choose our one creature, which will probably be Rafiq if we've suited him up enough, and we can from there just start beating face while our opponents only have more or less one blocker available. Open the Armory, a really cheap way for us to tutor for our auras. And with the instance, we've got the Broker's Charm from Streets of New Capenna. Definitely wanted to use some new cards in this deck tech. It's also got the really cool border. So target creature gets +1/+0 till end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker in opponent's control. So if we've got our Rafiq really big or one of our other creatures really big, it's great removal. You can also destroy an enchantment or draw 2 cards. So really nice modes here. Just a few more removal spells: Cancel, Return to Nature. I added the other charms because why not? Thought it would be fun. With the Trevor's Charm, you can destroy an enchantment remove target attacking creature from the game in case someone tries to, do the crackback on us when we're swinging at them. And the Bant Charm can destroy an artifact per creature on the bottom of its owner's library, which is actually really sweet. Great way to get around indestructible. And counter target instant spell in case players are trying to, I don't know, Psycrift us or whatever. We've also got Endless Detour, a new 3-drop removal type spell. Owner of target spell, non-land permanent or card in a graveyard puts it on top or bottom of their library. It's kind of awkward because it lets the opponent choose whether or not it gets put on top or the bottom of their library, but it's still pretty decent removal. Not the best, but not bad. Beast Within and Generous Grift, just all around good removal spells. Wash Away, we can either pay 3 to counter any spell or pay 1 to counter a spell that wasn't cast from a hand. So, casting it from your command zone or from your graveyard, what have you. Pretty good counter spell here. And then we've got the Silk Guard, which lets us put +1/+1 counters on up to X creatures. And then Aura's equipment and modified creatures you control gain hexproof until the end of turn. So if someone's trying to, destroy our creatures or Heliod's intervention or something like that to get rid of a bunch of our auras, Silk Guard is going to be great at protecting our stuff. And then we've got just a Arcane Signet and a Soul Ring as our main ramp pieces in the artifacts. And our enchantments, we got a Nettle Cyst and a Helm of the Gods. Both give +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. Nettle Cyst also gives you +1/+1 for each artifact in addition to enchantments. But if you see the theme, we've got this theme of like however many aura/enchantments you have, so the bonus will be compounded as you get more and more of these auras. Speaking of auras, we've got a lot of them here. Some of them are ramp, like the Grafted Growth, Wild Growth, Wolfwillow Haven, Fertile Ground. We got a good bit of the 3 drops as well as the 2, and we also got the Dawn's Reflection for the 4 drops. So we're not ramping super hard, just a nice moderate pace. We're just chilling. Then we've got a few ways that we can get some of our auras back, because a lot of the times with the auras, when you lose your creature, you lose your aura, so it's kind of hard to keep suiting them up, so to say. So with stuff like Griftspoon or Spectral Steel, Launch, Rancor, these cards are going to be able to come back once our creature is removed, so we can recast them and start beating face again. A few ways for us to gain protection from creatures like Benevolent Blessing, Spirit Mantle, so our creatures are more or less unblockable. A few ways for us to gain Trample, like the aforementioned Rancor. I love this card. It's one of my favorite cards in Magic. And the Armadillo Cloak, which gives +2/+2 Trample, and whenever a creature deals damage, you gain that much life. And a few of our removal type spells. So Cartouche or Strength, when it enters, the enchanted creature can fight something. Not bad. Got Kindred's Transformation and Darksteel Mutation, so we can get rid of those pesky commanders that we don't really want to see on the board anymore. Imprison in the Moon does the same thing, more or less. We've got some of our bigger hitters like Octopus Umbra, which is going to make the base power and toughness of the creature we enchant an 8, and when it attacks, you may tap target creature with power 8 or less, so a great way to get some of those blockers out of the way. More ways for us to get big bonuses off of how many enchantments we control, like Auramancer's Guise, Ancestral Mask. Down here, they each give +2/+2 for each enchantment/aura, depending on which one you're looking at. And then we've got Shield of the Oversoul and Steel of Godhead. Both are fantastic in decks like this. Steel is going to make our creature unblockable and gain lifelink, and the Shield of the Oversoul is going to make our creature indestructible and give it flying. So both give evasion, as well as just make it kind of a little bit harder for our opponents to deal with our creature. And so we can kind of keep up with the tempo. We've got a few cards like Keen Sense and Snake Umbra that let us draw cards when our creature deals damage to a player. And since we're going to be swinging with Double Strike most of the time, we're going to be drawing at least 2 cards per combat, so not too bad. And then one of the other kind of crazier ones is the Finest Hour. So it's an enchantment with Exalted. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, if it's the first combat phase of the turn, untap that creature. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So basically every turn we get 2 combats, which is great for taking out our opponents, especially since we got to do 20 damage to, or 21 damage to each of our opponents. And in the lands, you know, we've got an easy to build mana base, nothing too expensive here. We got some lands that are entering tapped, a few lands that are entering untapped, but you know, we still want to be able to hit our colors, and that's the main thing. Another card that we should mention here in the lands is the Cathedral of War. It enters tapped, but it's got exalted, so it's an extra exalted trigger that we can have for more or less free. Moving on to the battle version, we are doing a classic, which is Rafiq Infect. So we've got a good bit of the Infect type creatures, and if you notice, I'm not using all of the Infect creatures, and that's because as you move up in power level, you want to consolidate your win conditions more or less. So I don't want to just run a bunch of the Infect creatures just because they have Infect. I would rather run fewer Infect creatures with a few more tutors, so I can find those more efficient Infect creatures more efficiently, get those on the field, and start swinging. And when you do that, when you consolidate your win cons like that, especially in a deck like this, you can add more room for ways to either interact with your opponent or stacks out the field. So especially in these combat-based kind of decks, you want to be able to slow your opponents down while you're getting set and beating your opponents down. And especially since you have to swing at multiple players, it's really important that you're swinging at the people that are least affected by your stacks first. So you take those players out, and then as you move around the board and you start taking out everyone else, the stacks that are impacting those players heavily have less of an opportunity, less of a chance to actually stop you from taking them out next. You'd rather take out the players first that have the best opportunity to stop you. So as we move up in power levels, we're going to start adding in more of these stacks pieces, more ways for us to protect our Infect type dudes, like Spellskite, really fantastic. You can pay essentially 2 life to change the target of spell or ability to Spellskite, and as long as Spellskite is a legal target, we can change the target to Spellskite. So whether they're using a Sword to Plowshares on one of our creatures, or whether they're using like an Abrade or something on one of our artifacts, we can use Spellskite to redirect either of those type of spells onto Spellskite because it is a legal target. Mother of Runes and Giver of Runes, also great ways to protect our stacks pieces. We've got a Stoneforge Mystic, so we can tutor up some of the really important equipment in our deck. Beastmaster, so as we cast some of these creatures, we can gain a little bit of card advantage and not get, caught too far behind, since, in decks like these, we don't have too many great opportunities for card advantage, more or less. And then, of course, we've got the all of our Infect creatures, and I've tried to really keep it down to the 2 drops and less, with the exception being the Viridian Corruptor, because it's got that extra layer of text with when it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact. So on top of just being a 2/2 with Infect, which isn't too bad, we also get to, it's got that extra removal stapled onto it, which definitely justifies it being in the deck. Moving on to the sorceries. So like I said before, we've got more ways to tutor for the important stuff. So Anchor to Reality, we can sacrifice a creature. And since we've got a bunch of dorks, that's going to be pretty easy as far as getting that sacrifice. We can also sacrifice an artifact. We don't have a ton of them, but we can, sacrifice like an Arcane Signet or something. And this lets us search for an equipment or a vehicle card and put it directly into the battlefield. If the mana value is less than the sacrifice permanent's mana values, get scry 2. We don't really care about that too much, since we're probably going to be turning our mana dorks into, like a sword of truth and justice, most likely. Hunter's Prowess. Until the end of turn, target creature gets +3/+3, gains trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw that many cards. Great way for us to gain some card advantage. Unfortunately, it is a sorcery, so it's a little telegraphed, but it gives trample, which is huge, especially with the Infect, so we can trample over our opponents and kill them. But we're going to get double strike, so if we get to connect, we're going to be drawing a ton of cards off of these type of effects. Open the Armory again, so we can tutor. Steel Shaper's Gift, another tutor. Temporal Trespass is, we've got a good bit of instants in this deck. it's going to be pretty easy for us to get that temporal trespass off and get that extra turn where we can take out more or less 2 players in one go. Eldritch Evolution, so we can tutor for some of our important infect creatures. And with our instants, generally when I see a lot of these infect decks, they're just packed to the brim with these instants that pump up their creatures, and I actually think that this detracts from the deck. You would rather tutor for some really effective, equipments or auras, and use those to take out our opponents instead of just relying on a bunch of one-shot instants, because you'll use the instant to kill one player, but then you're gonna, your opponent's gonna be looking at you next and you won't be able to take them out. So a few that we can use, like Predator Strike, gives us trample in addition to just giving +3/+3, so very fantastic. And the other ones are going to be giving us protection more or less, so like Apostle's Blessing, Vines of Vastwood can also pump by +4/+4 if we kick it, so 2 mana for hexproof and +4/+4. It's really great. Got the Flawless Maneuver to protect, Heroic Intervention so we can protect, Veil of Summer so we can protect ourselves. Got Hunter's Insight, which basically does what the Hunter's Prowess does, but it's 2 mana less. It doesn't give the bonus or trample, but it's still a great way for us to draw cards potentially. Shared Summons lets us tutor for 2 creatures with different names. Worldly Tutor, so we can tutor again for some of our important creatures. And a Sajiri Shelter is just free real estate. It can either be a land or can give protection from the color of your choice till end of turn, essentially making a creature unblockable potentially. And then yeah, it's just a bunch of ways for us to interrupt what our opponents are doing. Stuff like negate, counterspell, resculpt swords, just a bunch of removal, counter magic. Again, we want to be able to protect our board and stop our opponents from, resolving key threats that can, stop us from killing them more or less. Moving on to the artifacts, we have our consolidated equipment, and these are just the ones that we really, are going to provide us a ton of value. So Mask of Memory, whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw 2 cards and discard a card. Since we've got that double strike with Rafiq, we're going to be drawing 4 cards and discarding 2, so that is fantastic value. Key to the City is a way for us to ditch some of the extra lands we're drawing or pitch something that we don't care about, and we can potentially make a creature unblockable, and we get to pay 2 when it untaps to draw a card. Swifty Boots, fantastic for making our creature give them haste and hexproof. Umezawa's Jite, fantastic since we have the double strike. We're going to get 2 triggers, and we can actually use the Jite's second ability in between the first and the second strike. So we hit them the first time with our first strike damage. Umezawa trigger puts 2 counters, and then before we deal the second damage, we can remove those 2 counters to get +4/+4 to our creature. So if we have an infect creature out, let's just say it's a 1/1, like our Blight Mamba, we've got it equipped with our Umezawa's Jite. We're going to swing, so we get the +1/+1 from the Rafiq. And so right now we've got a 2/2. We deal the first bit of combat damage. We're going to get the 2 counters on Umezawa's Jite, and then we can use those to get +4/+4. And then our second swing is going to, we can use those to give +4/+4. And then that's going to make our Blight Mamba a 6/6, which basically puts them at 8 infect off of 1 swing, which is pretty deadly, assuming that we don't have another equipment attached to it, or like our anchor, or, any of our other options. So really efficient, great for taking out our opponents, as well as just controlling the board with that giving creatures -1/-1. Shadow Sphere gives our creature lifelink and trample, both fantastic. We care more about the trample, but lifelink is also good. And we can also make permanents your opponents control lose hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. Very good for getting rid of those pesky hexproof type things that we don't want our opponents to have, or maybe they're someone casts a board wipe and they're trying to protect the board with a heroic intervention or something. We can use the Shadow Sphere to remove those. Conqueror's Flail stops our opponents from interacting with us. We've also got a Sword of Fire and Ice, which helps us control the board and also draws us extra cards when it deals damage. on top of giving +2/+2 and the pro red and blue, making it harder to block depending on the deck, and a Sword of Truth and Justice. This is probably, I mentioned this before, but this is probably the sword that we want to get out the most. And that's because this sword is going to let us kill players as long as, I mean, this is the only equipment we need on an infect creature in order to kill them. Because we're going to get that +1/+1 counter, and we get to proliferate. So we got our Sword of Truth and Justice. Let's use our Blight Mama again as an example. So right now it's a 3/3. We're going to swing at our opponent and get our Exalted triggers, making Blight Mama a 4/4 and double strike. So the first strike damage, we're going to deal 4 infect. And then with the Sword of Truth and Justice trigger, we're going to put up another counter on our Blight Mamba, which puts it at 5. And then we're going to proliferate. So now Blight Mamba is going to be a 6/6, and then we can proliferate the poison counter on our opponent. So now they're at 5 infect. Now our second swing with the regular strike damage is going to deal 6 extra damage, putting them at 11 infect. So it actually overkills them by 1 shot, but it's super efficient with this sword. I like this sword a lot. So, you know, most of the time when you're tutoring for a sword in the context of this deck, Sword of Truth and Justice is going to be your go-to. Moving on to our enchantments and talk about consolidation. You know, looking at, 34 auras down to just these 5 regular enchantments. So we've added a Deafening Silence, kind of stacked out the board a little bit. Sylvan Library, fantastic way for us to draw some cards. Wild Growth as a just cheap ramp, and a Finest Hour. This card is really sweet. I mean, it's just going to let us take out players super fast when this card resolves. I like it a bunch. And Rancor, again, I love this card. It just keeps coming back. It gives trample, which is something we really care about, and that +2/+0 is going to be absolutely huge. So, but yeah, as you're moving up in power level, as you can see with what I've done here is, I've consolidated how I'm winning the game, and I've added more ways to interrupt and stop my opponents while I'm beating their face in. If we're gonna go back to this deck, you could definitely start consolidating some of these enchantments, add in some more of the tutor type stuff, so we can find those really important enchantments that essentially just let us, one-hit kill players with Rafiq the Mini. Maybe some ways to cheat in some of the bigger enchantments, that the Colossification type stuff, so we can just take out players super quickly, give them less time to interact. With a deck like this, we're kind of just picking and drawing whatever we find, right? So if you want to take your enchantment aura theme with Rafiq and upgrade it, I definitely recommend doing what I've done with the battle version here. Again, consolidate those win cons, add more ways to interact with your opponents, and that'll definitely help power up your Rafiq deck. And moving on to the lands here, we've got a few lands that are entering tapped still. We've upgraded a little bit. We've added some of the on-color fetch lands. We've added, some of our shock lands, a few ways for our lands to be entering untapped and get that extra, essentially just upping the speed of our deck a little bit. These same fundamentals can be applied when you're doing the enchantment type stuff too, making your lands enter untapped and be more efficient in the colors they produce. Same kind of concept you do that I've done here with this deck. We've added Rogue's Passage so we can make some of our creatures unblockable. Got that Inked Moth, got the Inked Moth Nexus as another infect creature that's kind of hard to deal with, since it's a land when it's not, a creature. Hard to deal with. And again, we've got that Cathedral of War to hit our opponents just a little bit harder with the Exalted trigger. Before I move on to the glory version of Rafiq, if you've enjoyed this episode of Opalwave MTG and you think you've gained a little bit more knowledge about power levels in EDH, give me a like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what commander you want to see brew next. I had a ton of fun doing this deck tech, so thanks again, Shuddy, for recommending Rafiq of the Mini. Moving on to the glory version of Rafiq, we've definitely consolidated our win conditions, and we've added a few ways to actually lock out the board so our opponents can't cast spells anymore, and hopefully we have a decent enough board state and we can utilize Rafiq's really powerful combat ability to trample over our opponents and win that way. So generally, when you've got a deck like this where you want to be staxing out the players, You want stuff like Collector Roof and Stony Silence in your deck, and we actually are using those equipment still to, you know, kill our opponents. And those cards are going to stop us from equipping our creatures with those equipment. So we opted to not run the stuff like Collect Roof and Stony Silence, and instead we are running Karn the Great Creator. Not a ton of utility outside of the actual passive ability, which stops our opponents from activating the artifacts they control. Still a super powerful ability, but we don't really play around that stacks piece in a symmetrical way. So we needed the Karn in order to just stop our opponents and not us. And sometimes if someone exiles an artifact we control, we can use Karn to get that back. So there's a little bit of utility there, but most of the time you're just slamming this down to stop opponents from activating their artifacts. And as you can see, we've definitely pumped up our stacks pieces. We've got a lot of these, you know, whenever our players can only cast one spell a turn. These are some of the stronger effects. We've also got a Hushbringer, so we can stop creature ETBs and death triggers. Super important for stopping that Thassa's Oracle. Elishnorn, while we don't really care about the going wide, and the +2/+2 is actually pretty nice on, you know, the creature that we are swinging with. What we care more about is that -2/-2. It's going to make it really hard for creature-based decks to actually do things once this is out. It's just so overwhelming in the context of cEDH, so we've thrown it in here. Limvalis, we can stop our opponents from doing, you know, activating abilities of their creatures. Serra Ascendant is awesome in this deck. It's going to be swinging for 7 double strike, assuming you've got 30 life, which is a lot of damage and a lot of life to gain for you. Skyclave is a little bit of you know, interaction. We kept the Mother of Runes to protect our stuff. Ranger Captain, so we can either silence people on the turns that we want to kill people, or we can just use it as a you know, a proactive type of thing, and we can, you know, use it offensively and stop our opponents from winning off with, you know, an Underworld Breach or something like that. And then we've got a Lavinia. Azorius Renegade stops players from casting non-creature spells if the converted mana cost is greater than the number of lands they control, and if an opponent would cast a spell if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. It's going to be one of our lock pieces along with Drannith Magistrate. And we've got this new Scheming Fence, which when it enters, or as it enters, you choose a non-land permanent on the battlefield, and they can't activate that permanent, and Scheming Fence gains all the abilities of the permanent that you named. Super sweet in this deck, actually, and a great way to stop Thrasios. So you resolve this, stop your opponent's Thrasios from being activated, and then you can use your Scheming Fence to activate, you know, as a Thrasios, which is pretty sweet. And there's a lot of other things you can name too. I mean, heck, you could name a Soul Ring or Mana Crypt if you really wanted to, just have it tap for more mana. So, not bad. Weather Wayfarer, fantastic in a deck like this, since you know, we are playing that slow kind of grind your game, and we've got things like Seiju and Gaia's Cradle that we want to get out and you know, cast some of our higher end spells. We've got the Eldritch Evolution, Finale of Devastation to tutor out some of our creatures. A Fabricate, this card is sweet, and if you notice, we've, you know, while the Fabricate can tutor for some of our equipment, it can also tutor for the Knowledge Pool and the Omen Machine, which are 2 of our lock pieces, and we'll get to that once we get there. Winds of Abandon. Every time I resolve this card in cEDH, it's awesome. This card does so much work. It seems a little underwhelming at first, but giving your opponents the lands really doesn't matter that much. There aren't too many decks that actually run enough basic lands that it's going to matter. And overloading this card it's straight up nasty. Like, if you're running white and cEDH and playing some of the slower or grindier decks, this card is just so good. It breaks stalls so hard. Yeah, I've done nothing but love resolving this card. So, Court of Calling, another way for us to tutor our deck. Heliod's Intervention can be a massive blowout, destroying a bunch of artifacts and enchantments. And we've got a bunch of, you know, removal, extra tutors, and, you know, we've just made it a little bit more efficient. We don't include Force of Will or Force of Negation in this deck, mainly because we don't have a ton of blue in our deck. You know, we've got a little bit of blue, but it just didn't seem like enough blue to justify running those cards. So yeah, we've just, you know, we've kept it down to, we've still got the efficient stuff, like the 1, maybe 2 mana cost stuff. We got a Fierce Guardianship that we can use with Rafiq out, but outside of that, we're, you know, I just didn't want to have to run the extra ways to needing the discard, because it seems like it might be a little inconsistent in the context of this deck. With our artifacts, we've just added a few more ramp type stuff: Mana Crypt, Soul Ring. We've got the Arcane Signet still, and our equipment. We've still got the Mask of Memory, great way for us to draw cards. Conqueror's Flail, again, stops our opponents from interacting with us on our turns. Fantastic. We've got a Sword of Feast and Famine in addition to the Sword of Fire and Ice and the Sword of Sinew and Steel. So with Sword of Fire and Ice, we get to untap our lands, which isn't too big of a deal, but we did add a Stasis. So once we get Stasis plus Sword of Feast and Famine out, we are going to hopefully lock out the board, depending on how board states are looking. You know, if people are tapping out a bunch and you can resolve a Stasis, it's going to be pretty much game over once you get Sword of the Feast of Famine on something, since you can break parity on that Stasis and pay for it for the rest of the game. Sword of Fire and Ice is great for killing off those little creatures, and since you get that double strike, you can kill things with up to power, you know, toughness 4, which is huge. I mean, most creatures in cEDH aren't going to be exceeding that 4 toughness unless it's like a specialty creature, or like a bigger commander. So great way to, you know, kill off all those small dorks. Sword of Sinew and Steel, not a ton of planeswalkers running around in cEDH, but that second line of text, being able to destroy artifacts, is huge. Trinisphere slows our opponents down, just slows them down a bunch. Like, can't cast spells for free unless they pay 3. Another reason why we're not running the Force of Will or Force of Negation. We've got that Umezawa's Jite still. This card is just fantastic at controlling the board and also just delivering that final blow by giving the ++. Omen Machine and Knowledge Pool. These cards are both going to combo with our Lavinia and our Drannith Magistrate. So in the case of Knowledge Pool specifically, if we have a Rule of Law type effect, like our Archon of Emeria, where players can only cast 1 spell each turn, if we have that Knowledge Pool out, they're going to cast their first spell, and then they're going to try to cast one of the spells from exile with Knowledge Pool, which can't do that because you can only cast 1 spell a turn. So if you got a Knowledge Pool out with a Rule of Law effect, it blocks everyone out from the game. So you need to make sure that your board state is better than your opponent's when you do this, or else you're just going to lose. But if you have it with Lavinia or the Drannith Magistrate, it becomes a one-sided lock where you can, you know, still play the game and kill your opponent still. So you don't need necessarily a better board state in that situation. And then we've got Omen Machine, which stops players from drawing cards. And at the beginning of each player's draw step, the player exiles the top card of his or her library. If it's a land card, the player puts it into the battlefield. Otherwise, that player casts it without paying its mana cost. Since they aren't paying its mana cost, it's going to get countered by Lavinia. And because they're going to try and cast that card from exile, they can't because of Drannith Magistrate. So both of these cards will lock out our opponents with the Omen Machine. And this is assuming that they're low on cards. If they have a bunch of cards in hand, they still can use the cards in their hand to cast spells, so they could potentially still get rid of it. So it's a little weirder in that, you know, scenario, and that's why we've got both, so we can be a little flexible as far as, you know, how we're going to lock out our opponents. In the enchantments, we still got the Deafening Silence to slow down our opponents. We got a Rest in Peace to hit those graveyards. We don't really care too much about our graveyard. Rancor. This is a flex slot. You don't really need the Rancor. I just love this card so much, and it's so efficient at what it does. You know, you can make a little wiggle room to, you know, make room for some fun cards sometimes in cEDH, and this isn't really making that big of a sacrifice. Mystic Remora, Ristic Study, so we can draw, as well as that Sylvan Library still, and the Wild Growth to give us a little bit of extra ramp. Moving down to the lands, we definitely upgraded our land base. Got, you know, fewer basics overall, We've added the Boseiju and the Ganganjo, as well as the Otawara, all fantastic and just free real estate essentially. Gemstone Caverns, if we are not the first player, we can use Gemstone to get that extra land into play with the luck counter on it. Gaia's Cradle, fantastic. We're a creature-based deck. It's going to help us pump out some of our bigger stuff like the Elish Norn, or even just like, cast one of our swords and equip it in the same turn. And, all of our lands are entering untapped and ready to go. And we've still got the Ink Moth Nexus, so we can, sneak in some of those infect kills too. Thanks for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. Again, I'm your host, Jacob, and until next time.